You're in the wrong place if you think we serve your kind here.
The words hit Charlotte Bennett like a slap, but she wasn't the one they were aimed at. The high-end restaurant she worked at prided itself on exclusivity, but tonight, its true colors were on full display. Malcolm Hayes, a sharply dressed black man seated at the restaurant's best table, barely flinched at the server's veiled insult. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks and gave the man a calm but piercing stare. Charlotte, a struggling waitress trying to keep her head above water, froze. This wasn't her table, but the tension was so thick it felt like the whole dining room was holding its breath. She'd heard stories of subtle racism, but this? It wasn't subtle. And then Malcolm spoke.
Does your manager share your opinion, or would you prefer I ask him myself?
The server's smirk faded, but Malcolm didn't raise his voice. There was no need. His words carried the weight of someone who was used to navigating spaces where he was underestimated but never defeated. As Charlotte watched, her own insecurities as a working-class white woman bubbled to the surface. The wealthy customers she served every night treated her like she was invisible, and now she was witnessing someone else being reduced to something less, despite sitting at the best table in the house. But the worst was yet to come. Charlotte, struggling to juggle plates and her emotions, found herself standing at Malcolm's table later that night. When a mistake in his order led to an offhanded remark about her competence, something inside her snapped. Her palm connected with his cheek before she even realized what she'd done. What happens next will leave you stunned. One impulsive act, one moment of defiance. How could it possibly lead to an opportunity that changes everything? This isn't just a story about a slap. It's about what happens when societal lines of race and class collide, and how redemption can come from the most unexpected places. If you've ever wondered how a single decision can turn your world upside down, this is the story for you. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heart-pounding stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us all of the power of second chances. Let's dive into this drama. La Royale was a symphony of refinement. The gentle clinking of glasses harmonized with the murmur of polite conversation, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across polished marble floors, and the scent of aged wine mingled with the delicate aroma of freshly baked bread. For its clientele, this was more than dining. It was theater. Charlotte Bennett maneuvered through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every inch of the dining room, from the discreet nooks for high-profile diners to the less desirable tables near the kitchen doors. She had mastered the art of smiling just enough to seem approachable, but never enough to invite familiarity. Balancing a tray of champagne flutes, Charlotte paused at table 3, her practiced smile in place. "Your drinks, gentlemen," she said, carefully placing the glasses before the two suited men. "About time," one of them muttered, barely looking up. Charlotte swallowed her irritation and turned away, her heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet as she moved. Moments like this were routine, but tonight, her patience felt particularly thin. Her mind wandered to her mother, sitting at home, alone with the oxygen machine humming in the background. The pile of medical bills on the counter had grown taller this week, and the call from the hospital earlier hadn't helped. Payment overdue. Again. "Charlotte, table 4 needs their appetizers," Carlos whispered as he passed by, his tray laden with decadent desserts. "Got it," she said, snapping back to reality. Charlotte adjusted her apron, pushing thoughts of home to the back of her mind. She had a job to do. And yet, as she made her way to the kitchen, the weight of it all, the bills, the hours, the endless hustle, pressed harder than usual. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she entered the brightly lit kitchen. She stole a quick glance at the screen. Another notification from the hospital. She didn't open it. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she focused on the plates lined up on the counter, ready to be whisked away to waiting diners. She'd just loaded her tray when the atmosphere shifted. The double doors to the dining room swung open, and a tall man walked in, commanding attention with every step. Conversation stilled briefly before resuming at a lower volume. Whispers rippled across the room like the quiet rustling of leaves before a storm. Charlotte turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse. The man was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. His dark skin stood out in the sea of pale faces, but it was his calm, self-assured demeanor that truly set him apart. "Who is that?" one of the servers muttered as they passed by. "Malcolm Hayes," came the hushed reply. "The real estate guy, worth millions." Charlotte's curiosity piqued despite herself. She'd heard the name before, Malcolm Hayes, the self-made millionaire who had built an empire from nothing. But seeing him in person was something else. He carried himself with a quiet authority that seemed to make the entire room adjust its posture. The maître d', usually unflappable, was practically tripping over himself to lead Malcolm to a prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Other patrons stole glances, some with admiration, others with thinly veiled disdain. Miss Bennett, her manager's sharp tone cut through her thoughts. "Table 6 is yours tonight. That's Mr. Hayes. Do not mess this up." Charlotte nodded, tightening her grip on her notepad. She wasn't sure why her pulse quickened as she approached the table. VIP guests weren't new to her. She'd served celebrities, politicians, and business moguls before, but Malcolm Hayes felt different. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady as she placed a menu in front of him. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Malcolm looked up, his gaze steady and calm. "The Chateau Margaux 2015, he said simply, his tone polite but firm. "2 glasses?" Charlotte nodded, jotting it down quickly before stepping away. Back at the bar, she poured the wine with practiced precision, her hands steady despite the whispers she overheard from nearby tables. "Doesn't exactly fit the clientele, does he?" Charlotte's jaw tightened. She wasn't naive about the world's prejudices, but hearing them spoken so openly in a place like this felt jarring. Malcolm Hayes wasn't just being observed, he was being judged. Returning to the table, she poured the wine carefully, conscious of the room's collective gaze. Malcolm nodded his thanks, but didn't say anything more. As the evening progressed, Charlotte found herself glancing at his table more often than she meant to. His 2 associates had joined him by now, their conversation low and intense. Yet Malcolm's composure never wavered. He carried himself with a calm dignity that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of tension in the room. And then it began to unravel. Charlotte's feet ached as she bustled between tables, but the weight of the night felt heavier than usual. Malcolm Hayes, seated at table 6, had an undeniable presence. Even when he said nothing, his calm, composed demeanor seemed to amplify the judgmental whispers floating around the room. Returning from another table, Charlotte caught sight of Malcolm's associates leaning in closer to him, their conversation animated. Whatever they were discussing had drawn the attention of diners nearby, who tried and failed to look disinterested. "It's not about fitting in." Malcolm's deep voice cut through the surrounding murmurs, steady but firm. "It's about making space where none existed before." Charlotte paused for a second, startled by the conviction in his tone. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but the weight of his words stuck with her as she hurried back to the kitchen to check on his table's order. Her heart sank as she inspected the plates. Malcolm's steak, ordered medium rare, had been prepared medium well. She bit her lip, debating whether to send it back. But the kitchen was swamped, and any delay would surely draw her manager's ire, not to mention Malcolm's. Hoping he wouldn't notice, she placed the plate on her tray alongside his associates' meals and returned to the table. As Charlotte set the plates down, Malcolm's sharp gaze immediately focused on the steak. He didn't touch his fork. Instead, he cut into the meat, revealing the overcooked center. "This isn't what I ordered," he said, his voice calm but clipped. He placed his utensils down with deliberate precision, his movements controlled yet commanding. Did the kitchen not understand, or was it you? Charlotte's face burned. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Around them, the quiet hum of the dining room seemed to fade. I'll have it fixed right away," she stammered, reaching for the plate. Malcolm raised a hand, stopping her mid-motion. "Perhaps you should consider a job that requires less attention to detail." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a slap. Charlotte froze, her hand still hovering above the plate. In that moment, every buried frustration, every quiet humiliation, and every sleepless night spent worrying about bills surged to the surface. She thought of the whispers she'd overheard, the judgment Malcolm had endured all evening, and now he had turned that sharp criticism on her. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. The sharp crack of her palm against Malcolm's cheek echoed through the dining room, louder than the clink of glasses or the hum of conversation. Time froze. Forks paused mid-air. Diners stared, their mouths open in shock. The string quartet faltered, a discordant note cutting through the tension, before silence swallowed the room whole. Malcolm's head turned slightly from the force of the slap, a red mark blooming on his cheek. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened and turned back to face her. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes steady as they met hers. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest. Her hand trembled as the weight of what she'd just done settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She began, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean... What is the meaning of this? The sharp, angry voice of her manager broke the silence. He stormed toward the table, his face pale with disbelief. Mr. Hayes, please accept our deepest apologies, he said, bowing slightly as he spoke. This behavior is completely unacceptable. Charlotte, pack your things, you're done here. Charlotte's voice cracked as she turned to her manager, but the words wouldn't come. Her hand was still tingling from the impact, and her shame felt like it might swallow her whole. The entire restaurant watched as she untied her apron and placed it on the table. She could feel their stares boring into her back as she turned and walked away, her steps heavy and unsteady. The doors of La Royale closed behind her with a heavy thud. Outside, the crisp night air hit her tear-streaked face, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside her. She leaned against the cool brick wall, her hands shaking as tears blurred her vision. What had she done? Inside, Malcolm Hayes remained seated. He touched his cheek lightly, the sting still fresh. Around him, the room slowly began to buzz again as patrons exchanged hushed comments. But Malcolm said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. Slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The cold night air stung Charlotte's face as she trudged home, her breath visible in the dim light of flickering street lamps. Her hands trembled as she clutched her coat tighter, her mind a chaotic whirl of regret, anger, and disbelief. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what had happened back at La Royale was dragging her down. The sound of the slap, sharp, startling, and unforgiving, echoed in her mind. She hadn't even realized what she'd done until it was too late. Malcolm Hayes' calm, unreadable expression burned in her memory, along with the collective gasps of the restaurant's patrons. She'd felt their judgment like 100 sharp needles piercing her skin. How had it come to this? Her legs ached from the long shift, but it wasn't physical exhaustion that pulled her shoulders down. It was the shame, hot and unrelenting, that weighed her down as she rounded the corner to her apartment building. Charlotte stopped at the stoop, hesitating as she stared up at the weathered facade. The lights in her mother's room were still on, the soft glow visible through the drawn curtains. She could picture her mother now, sitting in her recliner with a blanket draped over her legs, waiting up for her. Taking a deep breath, she fumbled with her keys and opened the door. The faint hum of the oxygen machine greeted her as she stepped inside. Her mother, Ellen Bennett, looked up from the crossword puzzle on her lap. Though frail and aging, Ellen's sharp eyes immediately caught the tension in Charlotte's posture. "Charlotte," Ellen said, folding the newspaper. "You're home late. Did something happen?" Charlotte tried to keep her voice steady, but it cracked as she replied. "I lost my job, Mom." Ellen's brow furrowed in concern. "Lost your job? Why? What happened?" Charlotte hesitated, the shame bubbling to the surface. Finally, she sank into the worn armchair across from her mother, burying her face in her hands. I slapped someone," she admitted, her voice muffled. Ellen's gasp was soft, but sharp. "You what?" Charlotte looked up, her eyes already brimming with tears. "It wasn't just anyone, Mom. It was Malcolm Hayes, the millionaire." Her mother's jaw dropped slightly, and for a moment she was speechless. Then, shaking her head, she asked, "Why, Charlotte? Why would you do that?" Charlotte exhaled shakily, brushing away the tears that streaked her cheeks. "He insulted me, Mom. He made me feel small, like I was nothing. And I lost it." Ellen's expression softened, though worry lingered in her eyes. "Sweetheart, you've been under so much stress. I know you're stretched thin, but losing control like that, hitting someone, it's not like you." Charlotte buried her face in her hands again. "I couldn't take it anymore. The way people treat me, like I'm invisible, like I don't matter. And then tonight, with him, It just pushed me over the edge." Ellen leaned forward, her frail hand resting on Charlotte's knee. "Listen to me," she said gently. "You do matter. But what you did tonight, it was wrong. You know that, don't you?" Charlotte nodded miserably. "I know. I don't even blame my boss for firing me. I deserved it." Ellen squeezed her knee gently. "You made a mistake, a big one. But mistakes don't define you, Charlotte. What matters is what you do next." "What can I do?" Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking. "I've ruined everything. I've lost my job. There's no way I can pay for your treatments now. I've failed you." "You haven't failed me," Ellen said firmly. "You're human, Charlotte. You made a mistake, but the only way to fix it is to own up to it. Maybe, just maybe, you'll get the chance to make it right." Charlotte looked at her mother, her heart heavy with guilt and uncertainty. "What if I don't get that chance?" Ellen smiled faintly, her voice soft but sure. Life has a funny way of giving second chances to those who are willing to take them. Charlotte stayed with her mother for a while longer, talking through the tangled mess of emotions she couldn't sort out on her own. By the time she went to bed, her mother's words stayed with her, echoing in her mind. She didn't know how to fix what she'd done, but if the chance came, she promised herself, she wouldn't let it slip away. The city skyline stretched out before Malcolm Hayes, its shimmering lights cutting through the darkness like constellations on Earth. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse suite, Malcolm nursed a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of the room's soft lighting. He touched his cheek absently, the sting of the slap gone, but the memory lingering like an echo. He had expected many things during his visit to La Royale: exceptional service, fine dining, perhaps even the thinly veiled prejudice he'd grown accustomed to over the years. What he hadn't expected was her, Charlotte Bennett. Her face flashed in his mind again, a mix of fury, shame, and something else he couldn't quite place. She wasn't polished or composed like the waitstaff he usually encountered. No, she was raw, so raw that her emotions had spilled over in a single impulsive act that had silenced an entire room. Most people would have written her off immediately. A waitress with no self-control, unacceptable in a place like La Royale. And yet, Malcolm found himself intrigued. The buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. Picking it up, he saw that Jacob, his assistant, had sent a message. Details on Charlotte Bennett attached. Call if you need more. Malcolm sank into one of the sleek leather armchairs by the window, opening the file on his phone. He scrolled through the information Jacob had compiled, her employment history, her current address, and a brief rundown of her family situation. He paused at the note about her mother's health, chronic illness, mounting medical bills. "Interesting," he murmured, setting the phone down. For years, Malcolm had built his empire by recognizing potential where others saw obstacles. Real estate was full of broken buildings, neglected properties, and overlooked opportunities. He'd made his fortune by investing in what others discarded. And now, as he thought about Charlotte, he wondered if the same principle applied to people. It wasn't just her audacity that intrigued him, it was her honesty. In that moment at the restaurant, she'd been unfiltered and real, qualities that were rare in his world of polished veneers and calculated moves. But it wasn't sympathy driving his curiosity. No, it was respect. She'd dared to do something no one else would. While he certainly hadn't appreciated the slap, it was a testament to her spirit. Picking up his phone, Malcolm dialed Jacob. "Sir," Jacob answered promptly. "I want you to reach out to Charlotte Bennett," Malcolm said, his tone calm but firm. "I want to offer her a meeting. Bring her to the office on Monday." There was a brief pause. "Sir, if I may ask, why? After what happened?" Malcolm cut him off. "Because I'm not interested in what she did. I'm interested in why." "Yes, sir," Jacob replied, his tone hesitant but professional. As Malcolm ended the call, he leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. The decision was unorthodox, but then again, so was he. If nothing else, he wanted to understand what had driven Charlotte to her breaking point. He glanced at the skyline again, the city alive with possibilities. Charlotte Bennett might not realize it yet, but her story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sleek glass facade of King Horizon's tower loomed over Charlotte like an indifferent giant, its sharp lines and mirrored surfaces reflecting the bustling city below. She hesitated at the entrance, her thrift store blazer suddenly feeling too tight and too cheap for a place like this. People streamed through the revolving doors, each stride purposeful, their tailored suits and polished shoes, a sharp contrast to her sensible heels and secondhand handbag. "You don't belong here," her inner voice whispered, but she squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The lobby was a cathedral of modernity, marble floors, abstract sculptures, and a cascading glass chandelier that seemed to float in the air. Behind the reception desk, a young woman in a navy blue blazer greeted her with a polite, practiced smile. "Miss Bennett, welcome to King Horizons," she said, handing over a visitor's badge. "Mr. Hayes' assistant will meet you shortly." Charlotte muttered a quiet thank you, clutching the badge like a lifeline as she stepped aside. She scanned the room, trying not to feel like everyone was staring at her. "Miss Bennett?" She turned to see a sharp-dressed man in his early 30s approaching her. His expression was friendly but professional. "I'm Jacob, Mr. Hayes' assistant," he said, extending a hand. "If you'll follow me, I'll take you to your department." Her department. The words felt surreal. Less than a week ago, she'd been a waitress, an unemployed one at that. Now she was standing in the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar corporation, about to start a job she still didn't fully understand. The elevator ride to the 15th floor was silent, save for the faint hum of classical music piped through hidden speakers. Jacob glanced at her once or twice, but he didn't speak, and Charlotte was grateful for it. When the doors opened, she was greeted by an open-plan office filled with glass-walled meeting rooms, ergonomic desks, and employees typing away at dual-monitor setups. The air buzzed with quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the restaurant kitchen she was used to. "Here we are," Jacob said, stopping at a desk near the corner. "This will be your workstation. Your team lead, Marcus, will walk you through your tasks for the day." Charlotte nodded, taking in the sleek, minimalist design of her new desk. A brand new laptop and a notepad sat waiting for her, along with a small welcome packet. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the office. Jacob gave her a brief smile. "Good luck, Miss Bennett, and don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." As he walked away, Charlotte sat down and opened the welcome packet, skimming through pages of company policies and IT instructions. None of it made sense. She felt a knot forming in her stomach, the same one that had been there during her first shift at La Royale. "Charlotte, right?" She looked up to see Marcus, a tall man with neatly trimmed dreadlocks and an easygoing smile. "Yeah, that's me," she said, standing quickly and nearly knocking over her chair in the process. "Relax," Marcus said, holding up a hand. "First days are overwhelming, I get it. Let's start with the basics." He spent the next half hour walking her through the company's software systems and outlining her responsibilities. As he talked, Charlotte scribbled notes furiously, feeling more and more out of her depth with every passing moment. "Any questions?" Marcus asked, his tone patient. No, I think I got it," she lied, her notepad already filled with a jumble of terms she didn't understand. "Great," Marcus said, giving her a thumbs up. "You'll do fine, just ask if you need help." But Charlotte didn't feel fine. As the day progressed, her insecurities deepened. Every email she sent, every spreadsheet she touched felt like a minefield, and she was terrified of making a mistake. At lunch, she sat alone in the break room, watching her coworkers chat in small groups. Snippets of their conversations floated her way. Discussions about coding challenges, market trends, and strategies that sounded like a foreign language to her. "She's the new hire from La Royale, right?" The whispered comment from a nearby table made her stiffen. "Yeah, some kind of diversity hire, I heard," another voice said. Charlotte's sandwich turned to ash in her mouth, but she forced herself to keep her head down, pretending not to hear. She scrolled through her phone, scanning the company's organizational chart for the 10th time, trying to make sense of where she fit into this massive machine. By late afternoon, her anxiety had reached a peak. She was struggling with a data entry task when Malcolm Hayes himself walked into the office. His presence was magnetic, and the quiet buzz of the workspace seemed to pause as people noticed him. Charlotte kept her head down, hoping he wouldn't see her. "Miss Bennett!" his voice called out, smooth and commanding. Her heart sank as she looked up. Malcolm was standing near her desk, his hands in his pockets, and an inscrutable expression on his face. "Yes, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How's your first day?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted, feeling her cheeks flush. "That's expected," he said. "You'll find your footing soon enough." His calm tone was strangely reassuring, but Charlotte couldn't shake her skepticism. Why had he hired her? Was this some kind of twisted experiment? Malcolm seemed to sense her unease. "You're here because I see potential in you, Miss Bennett," he said, his gaze steady. "Not because of charity or appearances. Remember that." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. As the office settled back into its rhythm, Charlotte stared at her screen, Malcolm's words echoing in her mind. Potential. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. The days at King Horizons passed in a blur of confusion and cautious determination. Charlotte's mornings started with her poring over the welcome packet and frantically Googling terms she didn't understand. By the time she reached the office, she was already on edge, bracing herself for another day of trying to navigate a world that felt so far removed from her own. At first, every task felt insurmountable. The company's project management software was a maze of tabs, filters, and data inputs that Marcus made look effortless. Meetings were a whirlwind of acronyms and technical jargon that left Charlotte scribbling notes without fully grasping their meaning. But she refused to give up. Each evening, long after most employees had gone home, Charlotte stayed at her desk, determined to catch up. She watched tutorials online, reviewed her notes, and experimented with the software until she could complete basic tasks without double-checking every step. "Burning the midnight oil?" Marcus's voice startled her one evening. She looked up to see him leaning against her cubicle wall, a half-empty coffee cup in his hand. "Just trying to keep up," she said with a sheepish smile. Marcus chuckled. "You're doing fine, Charlotte. Better than fine, actually. Most people would have folded under the pressure by now." His words gave her a small but much-needed boost. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot." As the weeks went by, Charlotte began to notice small but significant changes in herself. Tasks that had once felt impossible now came more naturally. She was still slower than her colleagues, but she was no longer paralyzed by self-doubt every time she opened a spreadsheet or composed an email. She also began to see Malcolm Hayes in a new light. At first, she had bristled at his presence. His calm, confident demeanor felt almost taunting, a constant reminder of how out of place she was in his world. But as she observed him in action, her perception began to shift. In meetings, Malcolm was a different kind of leader. He rarely spoke at length, but when he did, his words carried weight. He listened more than he talked, giving his team space to voice their ideas and challenges. And when disagreements arose, he was quick to mediate, often finding solutions that balanced competing priorities with surprising ease. It was a stark contrast to the image Charlotte had built in her mind, a cold, calculating businessman who cared only about the bottom line. One afternoon, Charlotte found herself in the break room as Malcolm entered, his phone pressed to his ear. She couldn't help but overhear snippets of his conversation. "No, that's not enough," he said, his tone firm but measured. "We need to ensure the community benefits from this project, not just the investors. Allocate a portion of the budget for affordable housing." When he hung up, Charlotte hesitated before speaking. That sounded important. Malcolm glanced at her, surprised but not unkind. "Every decision is important," he said simply, "especially the ones that affect people who don't have a seat at the table." His words lingered with her for the rest of the day. Charlotte's turning point came during a team meeting where Marcus presented a new client proposal. The presentation was going smoothly until a question about user accessibility arose. The room fell silent as Marcus hesitated, clearly unsure how to address the issue. Before she could stop herself, Charlotte spoke up. "What if we approached it the way restaurants do with menus?" she suggested, her voice tentative. "Offer different interface options for users with varying needs, like how menus have photos for some diners and descriptions for others." All eyes turned to her, and for a moment she regretted saying anything. But then Malcolm nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "That's an interesting perspective," he said. "Let's explore that idea further." The rest of the team followed his lead, discussing the concept with genuine interest. By the end of the meeting, her suggestion had been added to the proposal. Later, as the team dispersed, Malcolm approached her. "Good work in there," he said. "Thanks," she replied, trying to hide her surprise. "You have a unique way of looking at things, Charlotte," he added. "Don't be afraid to speak up more often. This company thrives on fresh perspectives." As Charlotte settled into her role, she began to reflect on her assumptions about Malcolm. She'd expected arrogance and condescension, but instead, she'd found a leader who valued integrity and collaboration. She thought back to their first encounter at La Royale, the moment when her frustration had boiled over. At the time, she'd seen Malcolm as another patron who saw her as nothing more than a nameless server. But now she realized that he hadn't been looking down on her. He'd been testing her, perhaps even trying to understand her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You're not invisible, sweetheart. You just have to let people see you." And Malcolm Hayes had seen her. By the end of her first month at King Horizons, Charlotte felt like she'd climbed a mountain. She wasn't at the summit yet, but she was no longer at the base, staring up in despair. She was learning, growing, and proving, to herself most of all, that she belonged. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Pride. The rhythm of the office was deceptively calm. Keyboards clattered softly, punctuated by the occasional ring of a phone or the muted hum of conversation. Yet beneath the surface, the undercurrents of tension rippled, often unseen but deeply felt. Charlotte adjusted her chair, her back stiff from another long morning of trying to decipher spreadsheets that felt like they'd been written in another language. She had come a long way in her first month, but the cracks in her confidence hadn't entirely disappeared. The subtle whispers and sidelong glances from certain colleagues didn't help. "Did you hear she used to be a waitress?" The words floated to her from the break room, barely audible but cutting nonetheless. "Yeah, I don't get it. There are qualified candidates out there. Why her?" Charlotte pretended not to hear as she focused on her monitor, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The knot in her stomach tightened, but she pushed through it. She'd learned early on that confronting these whispers only seemed to confirm their doubts. It wasn't just the whispers, though. The skepticism bled into everyday interactions. During a team meeting, Charlotte had offered an idea for streamlining a client onboarding process. The response was lukewarm, with several team members dismissing her suggestion as impractical. Yet 2 days later, Marcus presented the exact same idea as his own, and it was met with enthusiastic approval. "Great initiative, Marcus," one colleague had said, oblivious to Charlotte's stunned expression. She wanted to call him out, to demand recognition for her contribution, but she bit her tongue. Drawing attention to the slight felt dangerous, like it might make her an even bigger target. Later, during lunch in the break room, she overheard Marcus and another colleague laughing about a new diversity report. "More corporate PR," Marcus said, shaking his head. "I mean, sure, we need diversity, but this forced stuff doesn't work." Charlotte stiffened but kept her gaze fixed on her sandwich. If there was one person who seemed impervious to the undercurrents, it was Malcolm Hayes. Charlotte watched him from afar, fascinated by his ability to navigate the complexities of leadership with such apparent ease. But as she observed more closely, she began to notice the subtle challenges he faced, ones she hadn't seen before. In meetings, Malcolm's authority was rarely challenged outright, but there were moments when his suggestions were met with thinly veiled resistance. Executives would nod politely, but subtly steer the conversation in a different direction. And when decisions were finalized, credit for successful outcomes often went to others, while blame for failures had a way of circling back to him. It was clear to Charlotte that Malcolm saw these dynamics for what they were, yet he never showed frustration. Instead, he played the long game, carefully choosing his battles and asserting himself in ways that left little room for rebuttal. One afternoon, she had the chance to see him in action during a strategy meeting. Fletcher, the senior vice president of operations, presented a report on supply chain improvements. "These numbers show significant progress," Fletcher said, his tone confident. "With this trajectory, we'll exceed our targets for the quarter." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp but calm. "Good work, Fletcher," he said. "But can you explain the discrepancy between these numbers and the figures from last week's review?" Fletcher froze for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Charlotte to notice. "It's just a matter of timing," Fletcher replied smoothly. The data hadn't fully updated yet. Malcolm nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. "Let's ensure consistency in the reporting process moving forward. I'll need a full breakdown by Friday." As the meeting continued, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something about Fletcher's response didn't add up. the first real clue came later that week. Charlotte was sifting through client feedback data when she stumbled across an invoice linked to one of Fletcher's projects. The amount billed was significantly higher than the budgeted figure from the previous quarter. At first, she thought it might be a simple oversight, but as she dug deeper, she found more discrepancies, small, scattered, but enough to raise questions. She debated whether to bring it up to Malcolm, but she wasn't sure how to approach the subject without overstepping her bounds. Instead, she decided to keep digging. Over the next few days, Charlotte noticed other red flags. During a casual conversation near the coffee station, she overheard Fletcher speaking with a junior executive in a low voice. "It's all about timing," Fletcher said. "If you position things right, no one notices the gaps." Charlotte pretended to stir her coffee, her heart racing as she filed away the comment. Later, while reviewing a departmental report, she found another odd pattern. Certain expenses had been shifted between accounts, obscuring the true cost of a project. It was subtle, too subtle to be accidental. Her suspicions grew, but so did her apprehension. Fletcher was a senior executive, someone who had been with the company for years. If he was involved in something underhanded, exposing it wouldn't be easy, especially for someone like her, whose position still felt precarious. One evening, Charlotte stayed late, her desk illuminated by the glow of her monitor. The office was quiet, the usual bustle replaced by an eerie stillness. She pulled up a spreadsheet of Fletcher's recent projects, cross-referencing it with older records. The pattern became clearer. Fletcher had been inflating costs on select projects, redirecting the excess funds to accounts that were harder to track. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but over time, they added up to significant sums. "Charlotte?" She nearly jumped out of her chair, turning to see Malcolm standing behind her. "Mr. Hayes?" she stammered, quickly minimizing the spreadsheet. "What are you still doing here?" he asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. "I was just finishing up some reports," she said, her heart pounding. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, he leaned against her cubicle wall, his gaze thoughtful. "You've been working hard," he said. "I've noticed." "Thank you," she replied, unsure where the conversation was going. "Just remember," Malcolm added, his voice quiet but firm, "hard work is only part of the equation. Knowing when to speak up is just as important." His words hung in the air long after he left, leaving Charlotte to wonder if he somehow knew what she'd discovered. As she packed up for the night, Charlotte felt a new resolve forming. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to uncover the truth about Fletcher. Because if there was one thing she'd learned from Malcolm, it was that integrity mattered, even when it came at a cost. Charlotte's hands trembled as she flipped through the spreadsheets on her desk. The deeper she dug into Fletcher's projects, the clearer it became that his deception wasn't just about padding budgets. There was a far more insidious pattern emerging, a network of falsified reports, inflated expenses, and redirections of company funds that pointed to something bigger. Late one evening, armed with a pile of evidence, Charlotte pulled up her email drafts. She began typing a summary of her findings, her finger hovering over Malcolm Hayes' name in the recipient field. But she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't as damning as it seemed? Her thoughts were interrupted by Marcus, who leaned against the edge of her cubicle. "You've been burning the midnight oil a lot lately," he said casually, though his sharp eyes scanned her desk. "What's got you so focused?" Charlotte quickly shuffled the documents into a neat pile. "Just catching up on some reports." "Uh-huh," Marcus said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Be careful, Bennett. Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong can get you burned." As Marcus walked away, Charlotte's heart raced. She wasn't sure if his words were a casual warning or something more deliberate. The next morning, Charlotte decided to take a bolder step. She requested a meeting with Malcolm under the guise of needing clarification on a client project. When she entered his office, the expansive windows bathed the room in soft light, but the weight of what she was about to reveal made it feel stifling. "Miss Bennett," Malcolm greeted her, gesturing for her to sit. "What can I do for you?" Charlotte hesitated, her fingers tightening around the folder she carried. "It's not about the client project, Mr. Hayes. It's something else." Malcolm leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Go on." She opened the folder and began laying out the evidence she'd gathered. "I've been reviewing some of Fletcher's projects, and there are significant discrepancies. misallocated funds, falsified reports. At first I thought it was just sloppy bookkeeping, but it's not. It's deliberate. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. What else? There's more, Charlotte said, her voice trembling. I overheard him talking about positioning things to avoid suspicion, and I found this. She handed him a copy of an internal email chain that referenced external investors, ones who seemed to have a vested interest in undermining Malcolm's leadership. Malcolm studied the documents in silence. When he finally looked up, his gaze was unreadable. You're certain about this? Charlotte nodded. I wouldn't have come to you if I wasn't. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just an internal issue. This is a conspiracy. As the days passed, the scope of Fletcher's betrayal came into sharper focus. Malcolm quietly assigned a trusted IT specialist to audit the company's internal communications, and what they uncovered was staggering. Fletcher had been working with a group of external investors, feeding them sensitive information about the company's upcoming projects. In exchange, the investors had been funneling money into Fletcher's personal accounts, effectively bribing him to sabotage Malcolm's leadership. But that wasn't all. There were traces of a coordinated smear campaign, leaked emails, doctored reports, and anonymous tips sent to industry blogs designed to discredit Malcolm. The goal was clear: to erode confidence in his leadership and position Fletcher as his successor. It's layered, Malcolm said during a late-night strategy session with Charlotte and a few trusted colleagues. They're not just attacking me, they're undermining the company's integrity at every level. Charlotte sat silently, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had never imagined that her discovery would lead to something so massive and dangerous. One evening, as Charlotte walked home, she found herself wrestling with doubts. Exposing Fletcher would mean putting herself in the crosshairs of a powerful man and the investors backing him. It would also mean risking her already fragile reputation at the company. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Mistakes don't define you, Charlotte. What matters is what you do next. By the time she reached her apartment, her decision was made. She couldn't stay silent, not when the stakes were this high. The next morning, Malcolm called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. Charlotte was invited to attend, though the prospect of speaking in front of such powerful figures made her stomach churn. As the meeting began, Malcolm presented the evidence in his usual calm, methodical manner. The board members listened intently, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. When Malcolm finished, one of the directors, a gray-haired man with an air of authority, turned to Charlotte. Miss Bennett, you were instrumental in uncovering this. Can you elaborate on how you pieced it together? Charlotte's palms were slick with sweat, but she took a deep breath and stood. It started with a small discrepancy in Fletcher's budgets, she explained, her voice steadier than she expected. As I dug deeper, I found more inconsistencies. The patterns were subtle, but they were there. She outlined the steps she had taken, from analyzing the reports to overhearing Fletcher's conversations. By the time she finished, the room was silent. One of the board members cleared her throat. This is damning evidence. Fletcher has betrayed the trust of this company in the worst possible way. As the meeting adjourned, Fletcher was summoned to the office under the pretense of a routine check-in. When he arrived, he was met with Malcolm, the board, and the security team. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Fletcher initially denied the allegations, but when confronted with the evidence, his bluster faded. "This isn't over," Fletcher spat as he was escorted out of the building. Malcolm watched him go, his expression unreadable. "No, it's not," he murmured. That evening, as Charlotte sat at her desk, Malcolm approached her. "You took a risk," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "You didn't have to, but you did. And because of that, we were able to stop Fletcher before he could do more damage." Charlotte looked up at him, her heart pounding. "I just wanted to do the right thing." "You did," Malcolm said, "and you proved something important, to me, to the board, and, I hope, to yourself." As he walked away, Charlotte felt a surge of pride. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel out of place. She felt like she belonged. The conference room at King Horizons Tower buzzed with anticipation, the tension palpable as the company's top investors took their seats around the polished oak table. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering city skyline, but inside, The atmosphere was anything but serene. Charlotte sat near the end of the table, her heart pounding as she gripped a folder containing the evidence she had painstakingly compiled. Around her, conversations hummed in low tones, investors whispering to each other as they glanced at the head of the table. Malcolm Hayes stood there, calm and composed, his tailored suit impeccable and his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Today's discussion," Malcolm began, his deep voice slicing through the murmur of voices, "is not just about finances or quarterly performance. It's about something far more critical, the integrity of this company." The murmurs ceased instantly, the gravity of Malcolm's words settling over the room. Charlotte caught sight of Fletcher Moore as he entered the room. He walked with the confident swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. His crisp suit and carefully curated smile projected assurance, but Charlotte noticed the faint flicker of unease in his eyes when Malcolm's gaze locked onto him. As Fletcher took his seat, Malcolm continued, "Before we proceed, Miss Bennett will distribute the materials." Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she rose, carrying a stack of neatly prepared packets. She walked the length of the table, placing a folder in front of each investor. Fletcher's lips curled into a smug smile as she approached him, but she ignored it, keeping her focus on the task. "These documents," Malcolm said, gesturing toward the packets, "contain evidence of deliberate misconduct within our leadership ranks. This misconduct has not only jeopardized our financial stability, but also undermined the trust that forms the foundation of this company." The room went silent, save for the rustling of paper as the investors opened the folders. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, feigning disinterest, though Charlotte caught the subtle tightening of his jaw. "Mr. Hayes," one investor, a silver-haired woman, began, "are you suggesting that someone in this room is responsible?" "Yes," Malcolm replied without hesitation. His gaze shifted to Fletcher, who stiffened in his chair. "The individual responsible for this betrayal is Senior Vice President Fletcher Moore." Gasps rippled around the table, and all eyes turned to Fletcher. His face flushed as he let out a derisive chuckle. "This is absurd," he said, leaning forward. "I've dedicated over a decade to this company. Whatever so-called evidence you think you've found, I'm sure it's nothing more than a misunderstanding." Malcolm's expression remained impassive as he nodded to Charlotte. "Miss Bennett," he said, "please walk us through the findings." Charlotte stood, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to falter now. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the room's attention. "The discrepancies first appeared in budget reports for the Quantum Edge project. At first, they seemed like minor errors, but as I reviewed additional accounts, a pattern emerged." She clicked through the slides on the screen at the front of the room, each one displaying evidence of financial manipulation. "These transfers," she continued, pointing to a highlighted section, "show funds being redirected to external accounts. These accounts are linked to entities with ties to Mr. Moore." The investors leaned forward, their interest piqued. Fletcher's confident demeanor began to waver. "And it doesn't stop there," Charlotte said, advancing to the next slide. "Emails retrieved from the company's servers show communication between Mr. Moore and external investors with stakes in competing firms. These emails outline a coordinated effort to undermine Mr. Hayes' leadership." The final slide displayed a timeline of Fletcher's activities, each action meticulously documented. "Taken together," Charlotte concluded, "this evidence demonstrates a deliberate attempt to sabotage King Horizons while profiting personally from the fallout." The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Fletcher rose from his chair, his face a mask of indignation. "This is nothing more than a witch hunt," he shouted. "You're using circumstantial evidence to scapegoat me for your own failings, Hayes." Malcolm stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "This is no witch hunt, Fletcher. The evidence speaks for itself." "This is a setup," Fletcher snapped, his voice growing louder. "You've been gunning for me from the start, Hayes. You can't stand that I challenge your authority." "This isn't about authority," Malcolm replied, his tone calm but cutting. "It's about accountability, something you seem to lack." The door opened, and two security officers entered the room. Fletcher's eyes darted to them, his bravado faltering. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You've made a powerful enemy today." "No, Fletcher," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "The only regret here is that we trusted you for as long as we did." The guards escorted Fletcher out, his protests echoing down the hallway. The room remained silent, the gravity of the moment settling over everyone present. Malcolm turned back to the investors, his expression resolute. What you've seen today is proof of our commitment to transparency and accountability. Betrayal of our principles will not be tolerated, no matter who is responsible. The silver-haired woman spoke again, her tone measured. Mr. Hayes, you've handled this situation with admirable leadership. You've not only protected the company, but reinforced the trust we have in you. Thank you, Malcolm said, inclining his head. I intend to ensure that trust is never broken again. After the investors filed out, leaving a quieter but no less charged room behind, Malcolm turned to Charlotte. For a moment, the weight of the confrontation lifted, replaced by something lighter, a sense of mutual understanding. You took a risk, Malcolm said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. And because of that, we were able to stop Fletcher before he could do more damage. Charlotte met his gaze, the pride in his words giving her a confidence she hadn't realized she needed. I just wanted to do the right thing, she said simply. And you did, Malcolm replied. Never forget that. As he walked away, Charlotte sat back in her chair, the tension finally easing from her shoulders. She had come a long way from the uncertain woman who had walked into King Horizons weeks ago, and for the first time, she felt not just like an employee, but like a part of something larger, something worth fighting for. The grand atrium of King Horizons headquarters hummed with energy, the usual professionalism of the corporate setting replaced by a festive air. Employees gathered in small clusters, their chatter punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Overhead, sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating the sleek modern architecture and the crowd below. At the heart of the atrium stood a raised platform draped in deep blue, the company logo gleaming behind a podium. The room exuded an air of celebration, a rare moment of pause for a company that prided itself on forward motion. Charlotte stood near the edge of the crowd, her fingers brushing the hem of her blazer as she scanned the sea of faces. She still felt a pang of nervousness in large gatherings, though it was nothing like the crippling insecurity she'd carried when she first joined King Horizons. Today, there was a flicker of something else, pride. The sound of a microphone crackling drew the crowd's attention. Malcolm Hayes stepped onto the stage, his imposing figure framed by the sunlight streaming in from above. The room quieted almost instantly, the murmurs fading into an expectant hush. "Good afternoon," Malcolm began, his deep voice carrying easily across the atrium. "Today, we're here to celebrate not just individual achievements, but the resilience, integrity, and innovation that define King Horizons." The crowd broke into polite applause, but Malcolm raised a hand, his expression softening. "But before we continue, I want to acknowledge someone who has exemplified all those qualities and more." Charlotte froze, her heart racing as Malcolm's gaze swept the room and landed on her. When Charlotte Bennett joined King Horizons, she faced challenges that would have deterred even the most seasoned professionals, Malcolm continued, his voice warm but firm. "She came to us from a background far removed from the corporate world, and yet, she has not only adapted, but excelled." A ripple of applause followed, but Malcolm wasn't finished. Her diligence and courage were instrumental in uncovering actions that threatened the integrity of this company, he said, his tone growing more serious. "Because of her efforts, we were able to take decisive action to protect not just our finances, but the trust of everyone who depends on us, our employees, our investors, and our community." Charlotte felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her. For a moment, she wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the crowd, but then she caught Malcolm's gaze, steady and encouraging, and she stood a little taller. "Charlotte," Malcolm said, gesturing for her to join him on stage, "your journey here is a testament to the strength that comes from embracing new perspectives and believing in the power of integrity. Please, come up." The room erupted into applause, louder this time, as Charlotte made her way through the crowd. She climbed the steps to the platform, her legs feeling like jelly, and joined Malcolm at the podium. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She paused, scanning the room before continuing. "When I first walked through the doors of King Horizons, I felt completely out of place. I didn't have the background, the experience, or even the vocabulary to keep up with most of you. A few chuckles rippled through the audience, and she smiled, relaxing slightly. "But what I did have," she said, her voice growing steadier, "was determination, and the support of a leader who saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself." Her gaze shifted to Malcolm, who gave her a small nod. "I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this company," Charlotte continued. "And I'm even more grateful to work with people who are committed to making King Horizons a place where everyone, no matter where they come from, can thrive." The applause was thunderous as Charlotte stepped back from the podium, her cheeks flushing with a mix of embarrassment and pride. Malcolm shook her hand warmly before addressing the crowd once more. As the celebration continued, Charlotte found herself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations. Marcus, who had been one of her harshest critics in her early days, approached her with a sheepish grin. "You've come a long way, Bennett," he said, clinking his glass against hers. "I was wrong about you, and I'm glad to admit it." "Thanks, Marcus," Charlotte replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. She glanced across the room and saw Malcolm standing alone by the windows, his expression contemplative as he looked out at the skyline. Something in his posture drew her to him. "You're unusually quiet for a celebration," Charlotte said as she approached, her tone light. Malcolm turned, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Just reflecting," he said. "Moments like these remind me why I started this company in the first place." "And why's that?" "To build something that matters," he replied. "Not just a successful company, but one that makes a difference. A place where people from all walks of life can bring their best selves and feel valued." Charlotte nodded, her respect for Malcolm deepening. "You've achieved that," she said softly. "Not yet," he replied, his gaze distant. "There's still more to do. True inclusivity isn't just about hiring or promotions. It's about culture. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels empowered to speak up, to take risks, to lead." He turned back to her, his expression serious but kind. "And people like you are proof that we're on the right track." Charlotte felt a lump rise in her throat, but managed a smile. "Thank you, Malcolm. That means a lot." As the evening wound down, Charlotte stood at the edge of the atrium, watching as her colleagues mingled and laughed. She thought back to her first day, the fear and doubt that had weighed on her, and marveled at how far she had come. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as she looked around the room, at Malcolm, at her team, at the diverse group of people who made up King Horizons, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known was possible. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated the small but cozy living room of Charlotte's apartment. The worn edges of the furniture and faded floral curtains betrayed its modesty, but tonight, the space radiated warmth and contentment. Charlotte sat beside her mother, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Her mother, Margaret Bennett, looked frailer than Charlotte liked to admit. Years of working long hours as a nurse and battling chronic illness had taken their toll, but her spirit was as sharp and vibrant as ever. She adjusted the knitted shawl draped over her shoulders and gave Charlotte a curious glance. "You've been glowing all night, dear," Margaret said, her tone playful but probing. "What's got you so excited?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. She had spent so much of her life hiding her struggles from her mother, determined not to add to her burdens. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wanted to share her triumphs. "I got promoted," Charlotte said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Margaret's eyes widened, her face lighting up. "Promoted? Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. Tell me everything." Charlotte leaned back against the couch, a small smile playing on her lips. "It wasn't just a promotion, Mom. Malcolm, the CEO, announced it in front of everyone at a company-wide celebration. He thanked me for my contributions, said I helped protect the company's integrity." Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I always knew you were destined for great things, Charlotte." Charlotte felt her throat tighten, the weight of her journey pressing against her chest. "You know, when I first started, I didn't think I could make it. I felt so out of place, like I didn't belong. But I kept going. I worked hard, I learned, and somehow I found my place." Margaret's eyes shimmered with pride. "You've always had it in you. You just needed to believe it yourself." Charlotte's gaze dropped to the floor, her voice growing softer. I couldn't have done it without you. Your strength, your sacrifices, they gave me the chance to succeed." Her mother shook her head, her smile warm and unwavering. "You earned this, Charlotte. Your determination, your courage, that's what got you here, and I couldn't be prouder." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city outside their window serving as a gentle backdrop. Charlotte felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for her success, but for the support that had carried her through the darkest moments. Meanwhile, across the city, Malcolm Hayes stood on the rooftop of King Horizon's tower, the cool night air brushing against his face. The celebration had ended hours ago, but he hadn't left the office. He rarely did on nights like this, when his thoughts were too restless to find solace in sleep. The city stretched out before him, a sprawling maze of lights and shadows. It was a view he had come to know intimately, one that reminded him of both the challenges he'd overcome and the ones that still lay ahead. Tonight, though, his thoughts weren't on profits or strategies. They were on people. Charlotte's journey played through his mind, the waitress who had dared to stand up to him, who had faced skepticism and prejudice but refused to back down. Her success was a testament not just to her strength, but to the importance of creating opportunities for those who had been overlooked. Malcolm knew that the fight for inclusivity and equity was far from over. There were still biases to dismantle, barriers to break, and minds to change. But Charlotte's story gave him hope. It was a reminder that progress was possible, even in the face of resistance. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, the faint glow of dawn beginning to creep into the night sky. A new day was coming, and with it, new opportunities to challenge the status quo. Malcolm's vision for King Horizons had always been ambitious, but now it felt deeply personal. He wanted the company to be more than a place of innovation and success. He wanted it to be a beacon of possibility, a space where people from all backgrounds could thrive, where diversity wasn't just celebrated, but actively cultivated. Taking a deep breath, Malcolm allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. The work ahead would be difficult, but it was work worth doing, and he wasn't alone in it. People like Charlotte, with their resilience and determination, would help lead the way. Back in her apartment, Charlotte placed a framed photo on the mantle, a snapshot from the celebration earlier that day. In it, she stood beside Malcolm, her colleagues surrounding them, their smiles bright and genuine.